My father kicked me out of the house for helping former inmates reintegrate after prison. He yelled, "If you've chosen this path, don't forget to close the door behind you." Now I'm a millionaire, and he's begging me to forgive him. Look, I know how this sounds. Another Reddit success story that seems too good to be true. But stick with me here, because this whole thing started with me being absolutely broke and sleeping on a buddy's couch in Phoenix, Arizona. I was 25 and had just finished my associate degree at Phoenix Community College. Nothing fancy, just basic business administration, because that's what my old man wanted me to do. He had this whole plan mapped out for me. Graduate, get some entry-level office job, work my way up the corporate ladder, buy a house in Scottsdale, and give him grandkids. The American dream, right? Well, I had different ideas. Instead of hunting for some soul-crushing cubicle job, I found myself drawn to this volunteer program called Second Horizon. They help former inmates transition back into society after prison. Housing assistance, job training, basic life skills, stuff most of us take for granted. Now, my dad was a classic blue-collar Arizona conservative. Worked construction for 30 years, paid his taxes, never even got a speeding ticket. To him, if you went to prison, you were scum, period. No exceptions, no sob stories, no second chances. You made your bed, now lie in it. That whole mentality. So when I told him over dinner that I was volunteer with ex-cons instead of applying to insurance companies, his face went through about 5 different shades of red. My mom just sat there picking at her meatloaf, probably knowing what was coming next. He started with the usual lecture about wasting my education and throwing away opportunities. Then he moved on to how I was naive, and these people would take advantage of me. But what really set him off was when I mentioned I might want to make this into a career, maybe get into social work or nonprofit management. That's when he lost it completely. Started yelling about how he didn't bust his back for 30 years just to watch his son become a bleeding heart liberal who coddles criminals. Called me ungrateful, stupid, and a few other choice words I won't repeat here. The final straw came when I tried to explain that these weren't just criminals. They were people who made mistakes and deserved a chance to rebuild their lives. I mentioned this older guy named Lenny who'd been in the program, talking about how he was trying to reconnect with his estranged daughter after 40 years in prison. My dad slammed his fist on the table, so hard the salt shaker jumped. Then he stood up, pointed toward the front door, and delivered his ultimatum. If I wanted to waste my life helping criminals instead of being a productive member of society, I could find somewhere else to live. And if I chose this path, I shouldn't forget to close the door behind me. My mom tried to play peacekeeper, suggesting we all cool down and talk about it later. But my dad wasn't having it. He wanted an answer right then and there. Either I dropped this volunteering nonsense and start job hunting like a normal person, or I could pack my stuff and get out. I looked at both of them sitting there, and something just clicked in my head. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was principle, but I wasn't going to let him dictate my life choices. So I went upstairs, threw some clothes and my laptop into a duffel bag, and walked out. The funny thing is, I wasn't even that committed to the volunteer work at that point. I'd only been doing it for about 3 weeks. But something about his attitude, the complete dismissal of giving people second chances, just rubbed me the wrong way. Here I was, trying to do something meaningful with my life, and he couldn't see past his own prejudices. I ended up crashing at my buddy Mike's apartment in Tempe. Mike was cool about it, but his place was basically a studio with a pull-out couch that had seen better days. I was sharing space with his 2 cats and a collection of empty energy drink cans that seemed to multiply overnight. For the first week, I kept expecting my phone to ring. Maybe my mom would call to smooth things over, or my dad would swallow his pride and ask me to come home. But nothing. Radio silence. It was like I'd never existed. The reality of my situation started hitting pretty hard around day 10. I had maybe $800 in my checking account, no job prospects, and I was sleeping on furniture that probably violated several health codes. Mike was being a good friend, but I could tell his patience was wearing thin when I accidentally stepped on Mr. Whiskers at 3 a.m. That's when I doubled down on the volunteer work. If I was going to be homeless and broke because of Second Horizon, I might as well throw myself into it completely. I started spending 12-hour days at their downtown facility, helping with intake interviews, driving people to job interviews, even helping some guys study for their GED tests. The work was actually pretty rewarding, but it didn't pay anything, obviously. I was living off ramen noodles and whatever free food they had at the volunteer appreciation events. Not exactly sustainable long term. But here's where things started getting interesting. The more time I spent at Second Horizon, the more I learned about the people coming through their doors. These weren't just random criminals like my dad imagined. There was Marcus, who'd been locked up for 15 years on drug charges and was now trying to become a certified mechanic. There was Sandra, a grandmother who'd gotten caught up in her boyfriend's embezzlement scheme and just wanted to see her grandkids again. And then there was Lenny Morales, this old-timer who'd been in the system for almost 4 decades. Prison had aged him hard. He looked about 80 even though he was only in his early 70s. But there was something about the way he carried himself, like he knew things the rest of us didn't. Lenny had this habit of showing up early to every group session and staying late to help clean up. He never talked much about his past, but you could tell he'd seen some serious stuff. The younger guys respected him, and even the staff treated him different, not with pity, but with genuine respect. Most of the time, he'd just listen to other people's stories and nod along, but occasionally, he'd drop these little pieces of wisdom that would make everyone stop and think. Stuff about patience, about playing a long game, about how the system was designed to keep you down, but you could still find ways to rise above it. One afternoon, I was helping him fill out some paperwork for a job application. His handwriting wasn't great because of arthritis, and he asked me about my family situation. I ended up telling him the whole story about my dad kicking me out. Lenny just nodded and said something that stuck with me. Sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones who understand us the least. And sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find out what you actually need. At the time, I figured he was just being philosophical. I had no idea that within a few months, Lenny Morales would completely change my life in ways I never could have imagined. But that's getting ahead of myself. Right then, I was just a broke 25-year-old sleeping on a couch, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life by choosing principles over practicality. Little did I know that sometimes the biggest risks lead to most unexpected rewards. So there I was, spending basically every waking hour at Second Horizon, and that's where I really got to know Lenny Morales. This guy was something else. Like I said, he looked ancient, but moved with this quiet confidence that made everyone pay attention when he spoke. Lenny had been released about 6 months before I started volunteering. After nearly 40 years behind bars, he was trying to figure out how to live in a world that had completely changed while he was locked up. Cell phones, the internet, even something as simple as using a debit card. All of this was foreign to him. But here's what was interesting about Lenny. While most of the other participants were struggling with basic stuff like job applications and apartment hunting, he seemed to have a different kind of weight on his shoulders. Like he was carrying around some unfinished business that had nothing to do with finding work or housing. I started driving him to his mandatory check-ins with his parole officer because he didn't have a license and public transportation in Phoenix is pretty much a joke. During these rides, he'd sometimes let little details slip about his past. Turns out Lenny had been arrested back in 1978 at the Mexican border. Border Patrol found him in a car with fake plates, and when they searched the trunk, they discovered weapons, expensive watches, and about 15 grand in cash. Classic smuggling operation. Except Lenny claimed he was just a driver and had no idea what was in the trunk. The judge didn't buy it. Neither did the jury. 40 to life for armed trafficking and conspiracy. Back then, Arizona didn't mess around with border crimes, especially if you looked like Lenny and had the last name Morales. Now, I'm not naive. I knew there was probably more to the story than Lenny was telling me. But what struck me was how he talked about it. Not with bitterness or anger, but with this weird kind of acceptance. Like he'd made peace with spending most of his life in prison for something that may or may not have been entirely his fault. What really got to me was when he mentioned his family. He had a daughter, Maria, who would have been about 8 when he went away. She was in her late 40s now, married with kids of her own, living somewhere in California. Lenny had tried reaching out to the prison system a few times over the years, but she never responded. Can you imagine that? Missing your kid's entire life because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. Whether he was guilty or not, that's a hell of a price to pay. But Lenny wasn't looking for sympathy. If anything, he was trying to help other people avoid his mistakes. He'd sit in on the group sessions and listen to these younger guys complain about how unfair the system was, and then he'd quietly suggest practical solutions, like this kid named Jamal who kept getting turned down for jobs because of his record. Instead of telling him to keep applying to the same places, Lenny suggested he look into construction work. Said most crews care more about whether you can show up on time and work hard than what you did 5 years ago. Turned out Lenny was right. Jamal got hired within a week. Or this woman named Carmen, who was freaking out about finding an apartment that would accept her with a felony conviction. Lenny knew about these transitional housing programs that most people had never heard of. Specific landlords who worked with the county to provide second chances. Within a month, Carmen had her own place. The guy was like a walking resource database. 40 years in the system had taught him every loophole, every program, every contact that could help someone get back on their feet. But more than that, he understood people. He could look at someone and figure out exactly what kind of help they needed. I started wondering why someone with his knowledge and connections was still coming to our little volunteer program. Most guys with his experience would either be trying to disappear into anonymity or would be working with the bigger organizations downtown that actually paid their staff. One day I asked him about it directly. We were sitting in the parking lot after a particularly long group session, and I just came out with it. Why was he still hanging around Second Horizon when he clearly knew more about reintegration than most of the professional staff? Lenny was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that has stuck with me ever since. Sometimes you can't move forward until you've properly closed the door on your past. And sometimes closing that door means making sure other people don't have to go through what you went through. He told me he'd been carrying around guilt for 40 years. Not necessarily about the crime he'd been convicted of. He was still pretty vague about his actual innocence or guilt, but about all the people who'd gotten hurt because he'd made poor choices. His daughter growing up without a father. His ex-wife struggling as a single parent. Even his old crew, who'd probably assumed he'd ratted them out to get a lighter sentence. The volunteer work was his way of balancing the scales. Every person he helped get back on their feet was like paying back a debt he owed to the universe. I respected that, but I also started noticing that Lenny was looking increasingly tired. Not just old man tired, but sick tired. He'd started having these coughing fits during the group sessions, and sometimes I'd catch him just staring off into space like his mind was somewhere else entirely. When I asked if he was feeling okay, he'd just wave me off and change the subject. But I could tell something was wrong. Prison healthcare isn't exactly world-class, and 40 years of institutional food and stress had probably taken a serious toll on his body. Then one Tuesday in November, Lenny didn't show up for the morning session. This was weird because the guy was more reliable than a Swiss watch. I tried calling the number he'd given me, but it went straight to voicemail. By Thursday, I was genuinely worried. I ended up driving to the address I had for him, this little efficiency apartment near the airport that was basically a step up from a motel room. The landlord said an ambulance had picked him up 3 days earlier, and nobody had heard from him since. It took me 2 days of calling around to different hospitals before I found him at Phoenix General. Turned out he collapsed in his apartment and had been unconscious for several hours before his neighbor heard him fall and called 911. The doctors were talking about lung cancer, liver problems, and a bunch of other complications that come from decades of not taking care of yourself. When I finally got to see him, he looked smaller somehow. All that quiet strength he'd carried around seemed to have leaked out of him. But his mind was still sharp, and he seemed genuinely surprised that someone had come looking for him. I visited him every couple of days for the next 3 weeks. We'd talk about the other program participants, current events, anything except his medical situation. But I could tell he was getting worse. The nurses were being professional about it, but I could see it in their faces. Then one afternoon, I showed up, and his bed was empty. For a second, I panicked, thinking the worst. But the nurse explained that he'd been moved to hospice care. End stage everything. Basically, they were just trying to keep him comfortable. The hospice facility was this depressing little place on the south side of town. Lenny was in a shared room with an old cowboy who spent most of his time watching game shows with the volume turned way up. Not exactly the most peaceful environment for someone's final days. I sat with him for a few hours that last day. He was pretty doped up on pain medication, but he was still coherent. We talked about Maria, his daughter, and how he wished he could have made things right with her, about all the guys in the program, and how he hoped they'd stay on the right path. Then, out of nowhere, he asked a nurse for a paper bag from his bedside table. Inside was this old, beat-up notebook, the kind with black cover and lined pages that you'd see in any office supply store. The thing looked like it had been through a war. Lenny pressed it into my hands and said something that didn't make much sense at the time. He told me there was stuff in there that he'd never been able to return to its rightful place, not for selling or personal gain, but for doing something meaningful, something that would help people like the ones we've been working with. The next morning, I got a call from the hospice. Lenny had passed away peacefully in his sleep. No family, no friends except for a few of us from Second Horizon. The county was going to handle the burial arrangements. I spent the rest of that week helping coordinate a small memorial service. About 20 people showed up, mostly program participants whose lives Lenny had touched in some way. Nothing fancy, just people sharing stories about how this old ex-con had helped them get back on their feet. It wasn't until after the service that I really looked at the notebook Lenny had given me. What I found inside was going to change everything about my situation, my future, and my relationship with my father. But I had no idea about any of that yet. All I knew was that Lenny Morales, despite everything he'd lost and everything he'd been through, had spent his final months trying to help other people avoid his mistakes. And somehow, he decided that I was the person to carry on whatever mission he'd been unable to complete. I just had to figure out what the hell he was talking about. So there I was, sitting in Mike's apartment at midnight, staring at this mysterious notebook that a dying man had entrusted to me. The first thing I noticed was how carefully everything was written. Lenny's handwriting was shaky due to his arthritis, but every word was deliberate, like he'd spent years thinking about what to put down on paper. The notebook was divided into sections, but not in any way that made immediate sense. There were rough sketches of buildings and landscapes, GPS coordinates, and cryptic phrases like white stone near the 13th beam and old water tower by Anvil Road. Mixing with these were what looked like inventory lists, descriptions of items with estimated values written in faded pencil. At first, I thought maybe Lenny had been planning some kind of heist or scam. The cynic in me wondered if this was his way of dragging me into whatever criminal activity had landed him in prison in the first place. But the more I read, the more it became clear that this wasn't about committing crimes. It was about correcting old ones. There were several pages dedicated to something called Uncle Vic's insurance policy. From what I could piece together, Vic Morales had been Lenny's uncle and apparently part of some smuggling operation back in the 70s. The notebook contained detailed descriptions of items that had been misplaced during various border runs, stuff that was never recovered by authorities or returned to its original owners. But here's where it got interesting. Lenny had spent decades researching the legal status of these items. There were notes about statutes of limitations, abandoned property laws, and something called treasure trove regulations. The guy had basically become a jailhouse lawyer, specializing in lost property recovery. According to his notes, Uncle Vic had disappeared in 1978, the same year Lenny got arrested. There was speculation that Vic had either been killed by competitors or had faked his own death to escape prosecution. Either way, he left behind several caches of merchandise that had never been recovered. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like the setup for one of those cheesy treasure hunting movies, where the hero finds a pirate map and strikes it rich. Trust me, I was thinking the same thing. But Lenny's notes were incredibly detailed and cross-referenced with historical documents, newspaper clippings, and even correspondence with various legal experts he consulted over the years. The man had done his homework. He'd identified 3 potential cache sites based on information he'd gathered from other family members before they died, combined with his own memories of conversations with Uncle Vic when he was a kid. The most promising lead was something called the Anvil Road site. According to Lenny's notes, This was an abandoned ranch property about 60 miles southeast of Phoenix, near a tiny town called Hayden. Uncle Vic had supposedly used this place as a way station for moving merchandise between Mexico and buyers in Phoenix and Tucson. The property had changed hands several times since the 70s and was currently owned by some investment company in California that used it for tax write-offs. Basically, it was sitting empty and slowly falling apart in the desert. But here's what really convinced me this wasn't just a fantasy of a dying man. Lenny had managed to track down Tommy Hernandez, who'd been part of Uncle Vic's crew back in the day. Tommy was still alive, living in a nursing home in Tucson, and apparently still had a clear memory of the operation. According to Tommy's account, which Lenny had documented in multiple conversations, Uncle Vic had been paranoid about getting ripped off by his own people. So he created these hidden stashes as insurance policies, emergency funds that only he knew about in case everything went sideways. When Uncle Vic disappeared in 1978, he'd taken the locations of these stashes with him. Tommy knew they existed, but had never been able to find them. He'd spent years searching the Anvil Road property with metal detectors and shovels, but never found anything. The difference was that Lenny had Uncle Vic's old notebooks, stuff that had been left at the family house when Vic vanished. Lenny's grandmother had held onto these papers for years, probably not understanding their significance. When she died in the 90s, Lenny had inherited them along with some other family stuff. Combine Uncle Vic's cryptic notes with Tommy's first-hand knowledge of the operation, and you had what amounted to a treasure map, a really complicated, possibly dangerous treasure map, but a treasure map nonetheless. The question was, what was I supposed to do with this information? Part of me wanted to just forget about the whole thing. I mean, I was a volunteer social worker sleeping on a friend's couch, not some adventure-seeking fortune hunter. Plus, even if there really was something buried out in the desert, it probably belonged to the victims of whatever crimes Uncle Vic had committed. But then I reread the note Lenny had written on the first page. Not for selling, for a real cause. The guy wasn't trying to make me rich. He was trying to give me the resources to do something meaningful with Second Horizon or whatever similar work I want to pursue. I spent 3 days going back and forth on this. I called in sick to my volunteer shifts and just sat around Mike's apartment, reading and rereading Lenny's notes, trying to figure out if this was legitimate or if I was about to waste what little money I had chasing a dead man's fantasy. Finally, I decided to do some basic verification. I drove down to Tucson and visited Tommy Hernandez at his nursing home. The guy was 86 years old and had diabetes, but his memory was sharp as a tack when it came to the old days. Tommy confirmed everything Lenny had written down. Uncle Vic had been running contraband across the border, mostly luxury items like watches and jewelry that were cheaper to buy in Mexico. Nothing violent or dangerous, just old-school smuggling for profit. When Uncle Vic disappeared, Tommy and the rest of the crew had assumed he'd been killed by competitors. But now Tommy thought it was more likely that Vic had seen the heat coming and decided to disappear before he ended up like Lenny, doing life in Florence State Prison. Tommy also confirmed that Vic had been obsessive about creating backup plans. He definitely hid merchandise at various locations, and the Anvil Road Ranch had been one of his favorite spots because it was isolated and had good access roads for moving trucks in and out. So I had independent confirmation that this wasn't just Lenny's imagination. There really had been a smuggling operation. There really had been hidden caches, and at least one of them was probably still out there waiting to be found. The next step was figuring out how to legally search for it. Lenny had done research on this too, and according to his notes, Arizona law was pretty clear. If you find abandoned property on someone else's land, you have to notify the landowner and local authorities. If nobody claims it within a certain period, you can petition for ownership. But there was a simpler approach. The investment company that owned the ranch had been trying to sell it for years without any luck. According to the real estate listings, they'd take pretty much any reasonable offer just to get off their books. I had about $600 left in my checking account. Not enough to buy property, obviously, but maybe enough to negotiate some kind of short-term lease or expiration agreement. Especially if I presented myself as someone interested in the historical significance of the site rather than its potential monetary value. I spent a week putting together a proposal. I researched the investment company, found out who was handling the property, and crafted this story about being a graduate student researching border smuggling operations of the 1970s. I said I was willing to pay a modest fee for permission to conduct archaeological surveys on the property. It was mostly true, just with some important details left out. The property manager was this burned-out real estate agent in Los Angeles who seemed thrilled that anyone was interested in the place for any reason. We negotiated a 6-month expiration lease for $800, more than I had, but I figured I could borrow the difference from Mike. 2 weeks later, I was driving a rented Jeep Cherokee down a dusty dirt road in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, with Lenny's notebook open on the passenger seat and a borrowed metal detector in the back. The ranch looked exactly like something out of a Western movie, weathered buildings, rusted equipment, and more tumbleweeds than I'd ever seen in real life. According to Lenny's notes, I needed to find the white stone near the 13th beam of what used to be the main barn. The barn was still standing, barely, and I could count the support beams even though some of them were rotting and falling down. The 13th beam from the left was near the back corner of the building, and sure enough, there was a pile of white stones nearby. Nothing obvious, just rocks that looked like they'd been placed deliberately rather than scattered naturally. Lenny's directions said to pace off 37 steps due east from the white stones, then look for the old foundation. I found what looked like the concrete remains of some kind of small building, maybe a shed or storage facility that had been torn down years ago. And that's where things got interesting. Because right there, mostly hidden by 40 years of desert growth and debris, was a rusted metal hatch built into what used to be the foundation. It looked like something you'd see on a submarine, with heavy hinges and a wheel-type locking mechanism. My heart started pounding as I cleared away the weeds and dirt. This was it. Whatever Uncle Vic had hidden out here, it was probably right under my feet. The locking wheel was rusted solid, but I brought a crowbar and some WD-40. After about 20 minutes of struggling with the mechanism, the hatch finally gave way with a screech of protest that probably scared every rattlesnake within a mile. I used a flashlight on my phone to peer down into the opening. There was a concrete chamber about 6 feet deep and maybe 4 feet square. At the bottom, I could see the outlines of several rectangular objects wrapped in what looked like military surplus tarps and secured with rope. This was really happening. After 40 years, Uncle Vic's insurance policy was about to pay out. I just hoped I was ready for whatever I was about to find down there. Getting down into that concrete chamber was like descending into a time capsule from the Carter administration. The air was stale and dusty, but surprisingly dry. Apparently Uncle Vic had known something about desert preservation when he built this little underground vault. There were 3 objects wrapped in those military tarps, each one roughly the size of a small suitcase. The tarps themselves were in decent condition, which was encouraging. If the exterior wrapping had held up this well, maybe whatever was inside had survived 4 decades in the ground. I hauled all 3 packages up to ground level before unwrapping anything. Call it paranoia, but I wanted to be able to run if I found something I wasn't supposed to find, like weapons or drugs or human remains. You never know what kind of business people were really in back in the 70s, regardless of what they told their families. The first package was the heaviest, probably 40 or 50 pounds. When I unwrapped it, I found an old ammunition box, the kind you buy at any military surplus store. But when I opened it, instead of bullets, I found 12 rectangular bars wrapped individually in what looked like industrial plastic. Now, I'm not exactly an expert on precious metals, but these things had the weight and color of gold bullion. Each bar was roughly the size of a paperback book, maybe an inch thick, with no identifying markings or stamps. Just pure, heavy metal that caught the desert sunlight like it was made of concentrated sunshine. I pulled out my phone and did some quick internet research. Based on the size and weight, these looked like standard 1-kilogram gold bars. The second package contained cash. Not just any cash, but the kind of old bills you'd see in a museum. There were bundles of hundreds, 50s, and 20s, all held together with rubber bands that had mostly disintegrated over the years. The bills themselves were in surprisingly good condition, considering their age. Most interesting were the bank bands still wrapped around some of the bundles. They were from Western Union Financial Services, which I later learned had been bought out and absorbed into other companies sometime in the early 80s. This stuff was definitely authentic 70s era money. I didn't count it all right there in the desert, too paranoid about being seen, but my rough estimate put it somewhere around $85,000 in cash. Not life-changing money by itself, but definitely enough to solve my immediate housing and transportation problems. The third package was the most intriguing. Inside was a collection of luxury watches, each one individually wrapped in soft cloth and placed in custom-fitted foam padding. These weren't your typical pawn shop Rolexes. They were serious collector pieces from brands I'd only heard about in movies. 3 Patek Philippe watches that looked like they'd never been worn. 2 Rolex Submariners with the kind of patina that vintage collectors go crazy for. And 2 Universal Geneve pieces that were probably worth more than my college education. Even without being an expert, I could tell this wasn't the kind of merchandise you'd find in your average smuggling operation. Uncle Vic had definitely been operating at the high end of the market. This was the kind of stuff that rich collectors would pay serious money to acquire with no questions asked about provenance or documentation. But here's what really got my attention. Tucked in with the watches was another note, this one written in different handwriting than Lenny's notebook. It was on old stationery with VM monogram at the top, presumably Victor Morales, Uncle Vic himself. The note was short and to the point. This is not for getting rich. This is for starting over the right way, for the family that comes after, so they don't have to make the same mistakes I made. Suddenly, everything made sense. Uncle Vic hadn't been planning to come back for this stuff. He'd hidden it as a legacy, a way for future generations of the Morales family to build something legitimate instead of following in his footsteps. And somehow, through 40 years of prison correspondence and jailhouse research, Lenny had figured out where it was. The question now was what to do with it. I could have just loaded everything into the Jeep and driven back to Phoenix as a newly wealthy man, with careful selling and proper tax planning. This could have set me up for life. But that note from Uncle Vic kept echoing in my head. This wasn't about getting rich. It was about starting over the right way. And after spending months working with people who were trying to rebuild their lives after making serious mistakes, I knew exactly what the right way looked like. I spent the rest of that day carefully photographing everything and researching the legal implications of my find. Arizona's treasure hunting laws were pretty straightforward. I had notified the property owner and local authorities, but since this was clearly personal property rather than archaeological artifacts, I had a legitimate claim to ownership. The tricky part would be selling everything without raising red flags with the IRS or attracting attention from people who might have less than legal claims to Uncle Vic's merchandise. Lenny's notebook included detailed advice on this front too. Apparently he'd spent years planning for this exact scenario. The key was to do everything gradually and completely above board. Establish clear provenance of the items, pay all applicable taxes, and make sure every transaction was properly documented. It would take longer and cost more in fees, but it would keep me out of prison. I loaded everything back into the Jeep and drove to a storage facility in Tempe, where I rented a climate-controlled unit under a 6-month lease. For the next week, I barely slept as I researched precious metals dealers, vintage watch specialists, and tax attorneys who specialize in found property cases. The goal was actually the easiest part. There are licensed dealers all over Arizona who buy and sell precious metals with no questions asked, as long as you can prove legal ownership and are willing to pay taxes on the transaction. I found a reputable dealer in Albuquerque who specialized in unmarked bullion. The watches were more complicated. These weren't the kind of pieces you could sell on eBay or take to your local pawn shop. I needed to find collectors and dealers who specialized in vintage luxury timepieces and had the kind of discretion that comes with dealing in high-value items with complicated histories. I ended up connecting with a dealer in Scottsdale who'd been in the business for 30 years and had experience with estate sales and collections that came with minimal documentation. He was expensive, 30% commission, but he guaranteed complete discretion and proper legal handling. The cash was straightforward, but tedious. I had to research the current collector value of old currency, since some of those bills were worth more than their face value to numismatics enthusiasts. But most of it I just planned to declare as found property and pay the standard income tax rate. All told, it took me 3 months to liquidate everything. The gold brought in $920,000 after dealer fees and taxes. The watches sold for $146,000 after commission. The cash totaled $83,000 after I sold the collectible bills and declared the rest. When everything was settled, I had just over $1.1 million sitting in a business checking account at Chase Bank in Phoenix. Not enough to retire on, but definitely enough to do something meaningful with my life. And I knew exactly what that something was going to be. The building I'd been eyeing was an old automotive shop on Indian School Road, not far from where I'd been volunteering with Second Horizon. It had been empty for 2 years, and the owner was motivated to sell. With some renovation work, it could be converted into a combination housing facility and job training center for people transitioning out of the prison system. I made an offer on the building the same day I received the final payment for Uncle Vic's watches. Cash purchase, no financing complications, close in 30 days. The kind of offer that real estate agents dream about. While the paperwork was being processed, I spent my time developing a business plan for what I was calling Second Roof, a nonprofit organization that will provide temporary housing, job training, and life skills coaching for formerly incarcerated individuals. The idea was to fill the gap that existing programs like Second Horizon couldn't address. Instead of just helping people find jobs and apartments, we'd provide a structured environment where they could develop real skills and build a foundation for long-term success. 6 months after finding Uncle Vic's cash in the desert, I was the owner of a renovated facility with 12 furnished apartments, a commercial kitchen, 2 classrooms, and a workshop space equipped for basic instruction and automotive training. Our first resident was Marcus, the guy from Second Horizon who'd been trying to become a certified mechanic. Within a year, we had a waiting list of people who wanted to join our program. We were placing residents in permanent housing and stable employment at a rate that was almost double the success rate of similar programs in the area. And that's when my phone rang with a call I'd been expecting but dreading for almost 2 years. It was my father. He'd heard about Second Roof through some mutual acquaintances and had apparently been following our progress through local news coverage and social media. According to my mom, who'd been serving as an intermediary, he was impressed with what I'd accomplished, but was struggling with how to approach me after the way we left things. The conversation was awkward at first, a lot of dancing around the subject of our last argument, and who had been right about what. But eventually, he got to the point. He wanted to help. Turns out my old man had been doing some volunteer work of his own over the past couple years. Nothing as dramatic as what I was doing, but he'd been helping with a Habitat for Humanity project and had gotten to know some of the families they were building houses for, including some folks who'd had run-ins with the law and were trying to get their lives back together. He said it had changed his perspective on second chances and the kind of people who deserve them. He wasn't ready to admit he'd been completely wrong about everything, but he was willing to acknowledge that maybe I'd been onto something when I decided to work with formerly incarcerated individuals. More importantly, he wanted to contribute his skills to Second Roof. 30 years of construction experience could be incredibly valuable for our job training programs, and he had connections with contractors who might be willing to hire our graduates. I told him I'd think about it, because as much as I wanted to repair our relationship, I needed to make sure he was serious about respecting the people we served and the work we were doing. This wasn't about charity or feeling good about helping the less fortunate. It was about recognizing that everyone deserves a real chance to rebuild their life. But that conversation and everything that followed is really the beginning of the next chapter of this story. Because finding Uncle Vic's treasure was just the first step in learning that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones you can't put a price on, like family relationships that you thought were broken forever, and the satisfaction that comes from using unearned wealth to create something that actually matters.